Good day, my Telos podcast friends. It's a pleasure to see you today. We got a really interesting one for you. We're diving into monoculture currencies, the nation state, the global problem with fiat money and how that has such a drive towards destruction of the planet and partly destruction of us as humans. And we all know this is a problem, but a lot of us just throw our hands up because it's such a big problem that it feels like there's nothing we can really do about it. Today, we're diving into some real practical steps that are being taken to create a new type of society. We're in a renaissance where communities can build their own currencies and then from there build up to interact with each other in a positive manner. And I know this sounds like very nebulous, but when you hear Reiki from Seeds and Jeff Emmett from Common Stack talk about what they're building, what they're doing, it's a clear picture of a way to move forward. Not only is this inspiring, but there's some practical steps that are being taken right now. The theory behind this is so interesting. It's just a beautiful podcast. That's all I can really say about it. This podcast today is wonderful, and it's sponsored by Crown.Club. The Crown DAC community is legendary, and also Hybrid.Games. You guys got to check out Hybrid.Games. The sound engineer Scott's been working on this for a year or more, possibly years. It's a new take, and it's interesting. Check out Hybrid.Games. Without further ado, let's jump into the podcast, my friends. Welcome, Reiki. Welcome, Jeff.
You're here because you know something. What you know you can't explain.
The Telos Podcast.
We're basically building new societies that people can step into. And so, Reiki, what are your thoughts on that, and where are things going?
We're building alternative financial systems and how these systems can serve as a foundation for a new type of society. The US is dealing with general elections right now, and not quite generals, but they're looking at essentially the circus of our political system. And so many people are completely fed up with what's going on there and seeing how ridiculous the entire system is. And what we're kind of campaigning for here is that there's an alternative. We don't necessarily have to continue playing in the games that we've inherited, but there's a different system that we could build and step into. And that's what I'd love to dive into a lot more today.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
Totally.
So stepping into these new systems, it kind of one of the things that holds people back is it's too big to change. There's too many moving parts. So what's that look like? Some sort of incremental approach where people are able to step into some sort of new blockchain governance, or what's that even look like?
Yeah, I think there's lots of experiments going on in the blockchain space right now, because essentially what this is a renaissance of communities being able to create their own currency systems. And when you create a currency system, that is an economic activity, but it's also very much a political activity, because you have to decide the governance of that system as well. How is money created? Who gets it? At what rate? For doing what, et cetera, et cetera. So it kind of opens up this whole new design space for what we can do as communities of people. And being able to design that in a way that it's effective at a global scale is very tricky. So top-down decision-making, trying to design a political system for the planet would be very, very difficult to do, because there's so many needs, there's so many wants, there's so much diversity. So what we're looking to do with the Common Stack is to start at the bottom, is to define that cell, that community economy, the market, the community market as that core economic unit of people, of neighbors interacting value, trading value between themselves, and then allowing that design to grow in a fractal nature, so that you don't just have individuals that can participate, but you could have communities participating, communities of communities, and communities of communities of communities, growing to this kind of like federated layer, from the community to the region, to a nation, to the globe, and infinite diversity in between as well.
Yeah, and what I'm loving about that diversity and this possibility is it's essentially the nation state or the civilization is coming to the free market. And what we're seeing is an explosion of, like you're pointing out, this diversity and opportunity for people to choose what type of society do I want to be part of. And now these civilizations actually have to provide the most value to people to encourage them to actually join it, because blockchain by nature isn't forceful or coercive or violent. So that's how our current nation states kind of operate. You're born into one, that's what you're given by birth, and if you try to leave it, it's very difficult, and if you don't follow the rules, you're compelled to do so with violence. But blockchain's inherently different in the fact that if you don't want to join, you don't have to. There's tons of people on the planet that see this movement happening, but have chosen not to even participate. So you have this inherent voluntarily built into it. And what's really cool is you'll be able to choose which type of, governance and financial system you want to be a part of simply by buying new tokens and exiting one and entering the other. So you can hop on in a weekend, you can decide what civilization you want to join, buy some tokens in it, step into it, start playing around, decide you don't like it and leave, So I think that's what's so beautiful about this experiment taking place.
Totally. I completely agree. I would hesitate to call them free markets, because I think it is a merging of markets and governance. And you can create, I think that's even more powerful. I mean, we have different ideologies define these things differently, so it's a little bit tricky. You can get into some semantic black holes there, but I see kind of commons markets, and this was actually fairly popular through the Central Middle Ages and the guilds. They would actually create market structures that respected their commons, as opposed to free market ideology often has this kind of extractive, profit-driven, capitalistic tinge to it. But I think when we merge free markets with appropriate governance, we actually create markets that respect people and the planet and profits. We can have all three. We just need to design those boundaries around those markets properly. And I think blockchain and token engineering offers us that opportunity to do so very carefully.
Yeah, I want to elaborate on that, because what I was mentioning coming to the free market is more of the meta scale, which is all of these experiments of different cultures and different civilizations and different financial systems are part of that free market. So they're actually competing directly with each other. Now, once you step into that system, this is when it gets really, really cool, because we can move away from the very dogmatic, what do we see on the stage today? It's it's either capitalism or socialism. That's kind of what everyone's talking about. Right. Even though the flavors of socialism being pushed out today are basically capitalism with a different face.
Right. Yeah, definitely. And that was Hayek made a point about the competition of currencies. He said, efficiency in a market or competition in a market is useful because you get better products or you get lower price. So competition on a market, on a free market, I see what you're saying there. If we allow these community currencies to compete on a market, then you have better and better offerings. You have fairer economies coming to people, because now it's a competition between these economies for users, for value in that economy. So totally agree there.
Yeah. And then what I would see is really cool is that people are choosing what financial and governance system they want to be a part of based on what their purpose is, what ethics they have, what value they want to receive for them. So we'll start seeing this really specialized, I can't think of a better word other than civilization. I want to call it society, but it's hard to say. But a global group of people that are able to get together, follow the same coordination rules, enter into the same financial system, and start being able to organize and play together based on what they want to do, rather than simply by product of where they were born.
Yeah, Jeff, you mentioned how in the guild system that there was markets set in place so markets can interact and respect the commons. Could you dig a little bit into what that means, or maybe give an example for people to grab onto?
Yeah. So I heard about this from Michelle Bowens of the P2P Foundation a couple of weeks ago, and I just finished a book he recommended called Change Makers by Adam Arvidsson, and he kind of analyzed, and actually I just finished in another book as well where they analyzed the Central Middle Ages, Bernard Lietaer and his complementary currencies. So he was looking at the Central Middle Ages as a time that had multiple currencies, and thus multiple forms of value. And I think that's one of the shortcomings of our current economic systems, is we have these currency monocultures at a national level. And it boils everything down to one number. It's the dollar value. You have a forest, and in dollar values, it's worth this as lumber, and there's no other monetary system we have to represent value. So it's worth nothing as a forest, but it's worth money as lumber. So we have this kind of incentive to turn the resources into lumber so that we can, earn profit off of it. In the guilds in the Central Middle Ages, I think they had basically control of the market so that they were able to offer their products within their rule set. So you couldn't just go and produce, a certain good without the permission of the guild. If you bring that to market, they basically had protections over their market system to ensure that the guilds and the people within the guilds were appropriately compensated for their work. These times were also very highly correlated with higher freedoms for women, both in the Central Middle Ages and another period that was analyzed, and actually have the book right here. Bernard Littaire's New Money for a New World. Fantastic analysis of complementary currencies. He also looked at dynastic Egypt, which also had a period of incredible historical emancipation of women, multiple currencies, and massive public works. Both in the Central Middle Ages and in dynastic Egypt, they had massive public investment in cathedrals, in the pyramids, and in all sorts of other public goods that they saw abruptly end after the imposition of a monoculture or a monocurrency, whether by the Romans or by the feudal lords or anything like that. So very interesting kind of, not necessarily causations, but at least correlations between multiple currency systems, multiple forms of value, the emancipation of women, investment in public works. It's a very interesting development that I'm excited to see play out again.
So it seems like one of the main points there is this idea that there's another way besides monoculture. And it sounds like they've had those competing currencies have worked at times in history and brought along a lot of social change with them. But then we kind of lose those possibly through some sort of imperialism along the way, and kind of people turning money into a monopoly for that control, because it seems like there's probably a lot of power. A lot of the power that nation states hold clearly is due to their control of the monetary system. And so it kind of we're letting some of the air out of that balloon, kind of seep out of that balloon, where people can go to a different community if they want. That kind of sounds like what Reiki's talking about. Mm-hmm. So how do you see what Jeff said, Reiki? How do you see that kind of playing out in modern day?
Yeah, I mean, we're already seeing that happening in cryptocurrencies right now, where there's 4,000 different cryptocurrencies, where each one of them potentially has a better place to use it. So I'd imagine most people in the crypto space own 5 or 6 or 7 different coins, and they own them for different reasons. Most of it's investment for this purpose, but we can see in the very short future, once a lot more utility starts coming on board, that depending on what type of interaction you're making is going to dictate what's the best currency to use for that interaction. Maybe you're in a local community and you get a 3% discount for using that local community's currency. Then you would start using it for that exchange. And when you step into a new community, there's a new community to use. And people often think of communities, and even in complementary currencies, as physical bioregions, like an actual location as a community. But what we're seeing with this digital space is that community actually isn't connected to a physical place. It's a digital space, a digital community that could be all over the globe. So that's what we have with Seeds, is we have a digital community that has a currency that's better to use when operating within that currency or within that community. And that's kind of how I see this expanding out, is this diversity of currencies that we all have within our one wallet, and depending on how we're interacting and operating, there's different currencies that offer different benefits. What I also think is really powerful is moving away from our monoculture of currencies that we have right now, and especially the way that they're designed, because that's actually what's driving the destruction of our planet. And I think this is a really important point, so I'm going to bring it up. When money is made with debt and interest attached to it, it's always requiring that we create more money in order to just maintain ourselves. Otherwise, there's going to be widespread bankruptcies and people not being able to pay back, right? That's why the world is, 70 plus trillion dollars in debt. I mean, it's always this odd question, like, who the world is in debt to at such a great number, So there's just this massive looming debt that everyone's paying interest on. And this interest is another form of tribute, essentially. It's the same thing as the empire. Like, there's countries all across the globe that are just paying this endless tribute, essentially, to these creators of money. But what it requires is that we're constantly transforming our natural world into money in order to be able to pay back this debt and interest. So we have this forest that might be able to be, sustainably logged for indefinitely. But we often don't choose that, because the alternative is, hey, well, we can actually cut it down for, $1 billion right now, or we can sustainably log it for 100K a year. 100K a year would meet all of my needs for life, but $1 billion, one, that's going to be able to pay off my debts. Two, I'm going to be able to invest it into something else that's going to go up in price. So it actually becomes more profitable to cut down that forest, which is what we see. It's more profitable to pillage and destroy our world than it is to maintain and regenerate it. So this is actually what Seeds is fundamentally about addressing, is how do we create a financial system that it's more profitable, more rewarding, and there's value to regenerating and healing our planet opposed to destroying it.
And I think that's the key to global coordination. Is I think a lot of people get that we're in an ecological crisis. They see climate change, they see resource depletion, they see all these things, but nobody knows what to do. Like, yes, we can eat less meat, you can travel less, but then we're still just kind of like there and waiting for the government to propose a subsidy. If they say, hey, here's a renewable subsidy, put a solar panel on your house and get 10 grand off, people are like, yeah, that's awesome. But then they go, oh, wait, my house isn't south facing, or, I live in a cloudy city, or, we're waiting for these coordination mechanisms to come from above, from this hierarchy, these governments that say, this is how you can all act together to reduce climate change, or reduce your carbon footprint. Now, if we create our own economic structures, we can create those incentives ourselves and incentivize ourselves to address those issues in a bottom-up, emergent way that is suited towards the needs of each community, rather than waiting for top-down subsidies and global coordination mechanisms to decarbonize or anything else that we're aiming to do.
Oh my gosh. And so if individuals are taking individual action to address climate change, that's amazing. Like, changing their diet, polluting less themselves, that's great. But if you're using these nation state currencies, then most of that is actually cut out. In 1 year, like, the globe together spent $5.4 trillion subsidizing fossil fuels to make them cheaper than renewable energy, so that we didn't have that transition. Like, what are we doing? In that same time plan, the globe spent over, I think it was like $1.2 trillion on warfare and profiteering off of war. And just to put this into context, so we're talking $6.5 trillion. The UN was coming out with this outrageous number. Everyone said it was too high, but they said we could end global hunger with $50 billion. Okay, so with that same distinction here, we could have ended world hunger 100 times over. We're talking about, what does it cost to put a civilization on Mars? Elon Musk is like, oh man, give me 500 billion and we can do it. We can have 1 million people living there with 500 billion. Cool. So humanity's collective wealth could have done that 6 times over. We could have ended world hunger, built the civilization on Mars, and still had a ridiculous amount of wealth left over from what we're using to subsidize fossil fuel industries and essentially kill each other. So it's really, really insane what our financial systems are financing. And that's mostly because people don't have a choice. We have no say in how this currency is spent, where it goes, how it's used. So I think that's the next step that people are going to be able to individually take action in is, okay, yes, I can, change my diet, but hey, I can actually use a currency that's better for the people on the planet than this one that's destroying it. Okay, so that's an individual step that I can take. And we want to make it really, really easy to do so. So it's just as simple as like, hey, it's like downloading a new payment app. Cool, I did my part.
So yeah. The theory is kind of that people don't have to basically fight against the traditional money system. They just have to opt out of it into these other alternatives that are popping up that align with their interests. And that in turn just slowly erodes the power that's behind all of those subsidies and all that.
Yeah, and
Debt's kind of the overall.
I think we don't realize that because money is so ubiquitous, and this is the only form of money that we and our parents' generation, a few generations before that, have ever known, fiat currency, that we think that's the default, the standard, that's all there is. But every time you use that money, when you earn it, when you spend it, when you pay taxes with it, you are complicit in all of the values of that currency. And unfortunately, fiat currencies have histories of oppression, exploitation, and through, and I'm not, we are complicit in that, not that it's anyone's fault, but this is also the fact that we are left out of the governance of these systems, which is why bringing governance into that, into the economic sphere in cryptocurrency design is so important, because we need to have these people at the table rather than continuing to use currencies that, propagate colonialism and everything that got these first world nations to where they are. It was resource extraction from countries and economies that didn't have those opportunities. So it's really I completely agree with Reiki about seeds. Choosing to use a conscious currency is one of those biggest I think impacts you can make, especially moving forward as more and more of these kinds of currencies flourish.
Yeah, I think. Go ahead, Reiki.
Well, I want to expand on this, and thank you. That's beautiful. There's just something that came up, and that's there's so many people living today that are dealing with looming debt that they're never going to pay off, or their credit's completely shot and they're not able to get a loan. They're not able to get access to these financial resources just due to the life situation that they were handed. So a lot of people have this massive debt just because that's how our system's intentionally designed to essentially get people into debt, because it's a new form of indentured servitude, really. Is in order to get an education, you have to go and get into massive amount of debt in order to get that education. And university education has gone up like tenfold in the last few years. It's ridiculous how much more expensive it is today than it ever was. And that's what they're saying, is it's a product of it being able to get pushed off into loans and debt. So now we see some of our most brilliant people who have these really beautiful intentions for the world ending up with $300,000 in school debt. And the only thing they can do now is then go work for money. They may have wanted to go work for a nonprofit or do something else and, maybe start a business, but they can't, because they have to pay off this debt and interest. So they have to go chase the money that's going to help them pay it off. And then they end up spending 500 or 600, even more, thousand, repaying that loan just to break even. And this is what we see with our debt and, usury, which usury is a form of, is what they call interest on money. But either way, this is what we're seeing with that system. So what these alternatives are providing people that are in all of those types of situations is a way to just step out. It's kind of like our own built-in debt jubilee. So we see civilizations throughout time that have had debt systems where they got so eroded that, time and time again, they had this thing called the Debt Jubilee, where, the emperor, the Romer, whoever was, leading the civilization at the time was like, hey, you know what, we're just going to cancel all debts and restart over. Like, it got out of control. And this happens very frequently. And I don't necessarily see that happening on a top down where, the control structures themselves say, hey, we're going to forgive all debts. But I do see that being a built-in part of this renaissance happening, where we can step into a new system where those debts no longer exist. And then how you deal with your debts in an old system, that's still up to you. But now there's an alternative. If you have no credit in that system, well, we don't necessarily look at that in this new DeFi system. We don't say if you have credit or not. We let you in and everyone gets a clean slate. So it's basically a way of resetting and starting over for all these people who have been given a bad card as well.
And how do you see, so you mentioned basically the loan system and interest and being able, a big part of the fiat culture is to take out loans, put that into some bigger business that you couldn't afford and then kind of generate some income that way. Do you see the fiat systems kind of still being a mechanism for taking out business loans and things like that? And then this is kind of a cryptocurrency being transactional, or do you see those fiat sometime, do you see cryptocurrency at some point being able to step in and kind of do that end of it too?
Cryptocurrency is already offering loans. So I already see that stepping into the game. Just from the perspective of seeds, we're going to be offering loans for definitely setting up business, growing the movement. There's actually an earmarking for regenerative loans so that people are going to be able to apply for loans to set up regenerative agriculture or any industry that's helping transition us towards more regenerative culture. But what's really unique about seeds is there's no interest on these loans. So, and that's what I think is, fundamental for us to get right. We start seeing negative interest that's happening and people have no concept of what that's about and think it's terrible. But with the negative interest, this is kind of a tangent, but I think it's also important. Why negative interest isn't terrible for the people who aren't aware is it reverses that drive to destroy our planet in order to keep paying off interest. So that's why central banks, in one way are looking at this negative interest is like, okay, if we keep with interest, we're going to have an economic collapse and we're going to keep destroying our planet. So if we go to negative interest, we get rid of that incentive and drive. But people are looking at that being like, oh, that's terrible. We have to run to crypto, but whatever. What we're looking at in all these alternative systems is let's get rid of the interest drive altogether. Let's create money with no interest attached to it. We can give loans now at 0% interest, and it's still good for the economy and the financial system because the value that person's creating. And now that person can go create, value at a 1% yearly growth, and they're not going under, because if interest is at 6%, you have to get at least 6% and more in order to get profit. And there's very few industries today that are offering that. So it's just more practical too. So that's what I see is, yes, the fiat systems are still a place to go get loans right now. That's fairly quickly going away. And the ability to get loans with no interest is so far superior than what the fiat system's offering that I think that's going to entice a lot of people to step in and start joining this as well.
And do you see that? And can you explain a little bit of the mechanics of how that works? I know that like salt lending back in, a year or two ago, basically you'd put up, let's say 1 Bitcoin, they'd loan you 5 Bitcoin or something like that. So is that a kind of a collateralized loan that can be liquidated, or how's that actually function if you're giving out loans with no interest?
Yeah, so there's two answers to that. One is a collateralized debt position component, but the first one is, and the best way of looking at this is central banks made $12 trillion in the last decade. What Seeds does is we're creating new currency when there's new demand for currency, so the value of currency remains stable, okay? It's similar to what nation states could be doing. They're creating new currency whenever there's new demand, but they're also creating way more of it, so that's why the value is always going down. So all we're doing is we're creating new currency, but it's what we do with this new currency that we're creating is interesting. So it's as if the central banks got together with their 12 trillion and said, hey, we're going to set 8 of that aside for all of citizens of the world to actually request loans from to do beautiful things. And then people request a loan directly to the central banks. Everyone votes on what they actually want to fund, and then that person's able to get a 0 interest loan. So that's kind of like if we mapped over what we're doing with our current systems. So we're creating new currency. It's sitting in a pool. People are voting on or choosing to, request a loan there. And then the citizens themselves say like, yes, let's give that person a loan. And they actually are the ones that are deciding who we give finances to.
Cool. And what's Seeds specifically? I don't if it's up and running for loans. What type of loans are you giving out for? What type of projects?
Sure. So we don't have that loan component yet because we're not actually growing new currency yet. So for the next year, we have a fixed supply of tokens. And then after that, we'll start this dynamic protocols that create stability and grow new currency and then start this loan system. But already baked into the system, we have some currency set aside for grants for projects. So it's a similar thing, but it's actually a grant that we're giving out to projects who are doing good for the world rather than requesting a loan.
So loans would be expected to be paid back. Is that correct?
Yes, definitely. Loans are paid back. And depending on the industry that they're in, there's going to be a period where they don't have to pay. So we're actually really, really looking at regenerative agriculture because agriculture is the #1 place that we can reverse climate crisis if we change our agriculture practices. Also, it creates a really solid foundation for any economic system. Every civilization lives and dies based off its food system. This is what we see historically. When the food system collapses, the civilization collapses. So that's why we're looking at food, because we need a new foundation. And then if you have a currency system that's growing food, then everyone has an immediate daily use case for this currency. I can buy food with it. And if you could buy food with your currency, now you'll accept it for all these other services you're doing. So for a lot of reasons, we're focused on food. So we look at the transition to regenerative agriculture. It usually takes farmers about 1.5 years, 2 years before they're able to like really see the benefits of that investment. So that's also a reason why we don't see so much transition to regenerative ag, is because our current fiat systems don't offer that 2-year window before you have to start paying it back. So it becomes very difficult for people to get the loan in transition. But that's what we would offer, is we'd say, hey, until you start being profitable, you don't have to start paying it back. And then the reason of paying it back is really just to be able to make sure there's a demand for seeds for selling food. So they sell their food to get seeds to pay back their loan. Great, now restaurants can buy food with seeds, and then we start this cycle of being able to set up a local food economy.
Cool. I've been doing some research into low 0% or -% interest on currencies, and one of the tricky things about 0% interest, and they're experimenting with this in a lot of mutual credit systems where you create currency just between two people out of the trust that you have for each other. How you get people to pay back that debt at 0% interest, because interest is essentially an incentive to pay back that loan sooner, because the longer you hold the loan out, the more you're paying in interest. So it's actually an encouragement for people to pay back the loan. But when you have 0% interest, how do you ensure the loans do get paid?
Sure. 2 ways. Actually, we build into the system that you're paying it back. So it'll take X% of every one of your transactions to slowly pay back the loan over time. So that's something that we technologically build into it. But we actually do have that other incentive too, because our US dollars, they look down. Their purchasing power is going down over time. Okay? Bitcoin's purchasing power is going up over time. What we're doing with seeds is, and our intent is to have the purchasing power stay flat over time. So what this means is that relative to the US dollar, which is going down, the value of seeds is actually going up. So people are wanting future seeds, and actually your loan relative to US dollars is going up over time too. Yes, in purchasing power is actually staying flat, but if you're thinking in terms of US dollars, you're saying, okay, if I pay back this loan sooner, I'm going to pay it back in less US dollar value than if I paid it off in, a year from now. So there's still that incentive to pay it off sooner. It's just the principle itself isn't being compounded with interest.
Gotcha. Very cool. Yeah, I was interested also in negative interest rate currencies and demurrage currencies, they call them, because that actually, that was the local currency is generally in some of these ancient cultures, the local currency has a negative interest rate, which makes it kind of a natural thing, right? When you have a vault full of money, it doesn't go bad. But if you have a vault full of mangoes, you have some incentive to like use those mangoes. If you have too many mangoes, you gotta share those mangoes, because they're gonna go bad. And then you're gonna have a big mess on your hands, let alone like all that waste. So, these local currencies in dynastic Egypt were like stores of wheat, for example. So they would put in 10 bushels of wheat and they would get 10 credits. But when they go to pick up those bushels, they would only get 9. So one of those tokens, it was like 10% demurrage. So actually they were encouraged, and they saw throughout multiple examples of this, that people pay their taxes early because they want to pay their taxes. They invest in public works because the local cathedral would bring tourism. So everyone would pool their money, because otherwise your money's kind of going bad. It turns money into like a natural object. So that encouraged them to spend it. Of course, you still have your other currency, maybe gold, your like international currency or your long distance currency, but your local currency was one that was depreciating in value, so it encouraged spending. So I know demurrage, like people, especially in our today's financial system, look at it and go, "You mean my money gets smaller in value over time? It doesn't make sense." We have this this bias towards investing, growing your money. And this is how things should go. But actually with multiple currencies, you could have both systems in whatever relation made sense to you. So really interesting experiments to come, I think.
Yeah, I'd like demurrage in theory, and certainly if we could do it as a whole globe, top down, implement a demurrage system, it might work. But if we're talking about, like we were at the beginning of this, where people are choosing which financial system to step into and operate, if you're choosing between Bitcoin, which is an appreciating currency, or another currency which is depreciating, you're not going to choose that currency. You're not going to move your value into that one. It's absurd. I wouldn't do it, even though I know a lot about demurrage and I think it's great. I still wouldn't adopt a currency into intermedium that was a demurrage based currency. So I don't see that ever happening, or at least getting a lot of traction, just due to that nature. Unless it happened on a top down. So let's say that we did step into this alternative system that had these different really cool mechanics and it grew to have 8 billion people using it or whatever, then it makes sense to start changing the code to look at, different ways of handling it. But yeah, anyway.
So, I mean, the interesting thing is when demurrage is like one mechanism that could be implemented as appropriate. So perhaps, 1% of your currency every month goes into a public pot. And that public pot is then governed by the community to spend towards, whatever that community determines appropriate. So I think there's different ways. It doesn't necessarily have to be value that just disappears, but perhaps that's, another form of distribution or pre-distribution, redistribution of community funds. So interesting to see what kind of experiments will try that, and again, what use cases they can fulfill.
Mm.
Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit more about where you see this going with the common stack, Jeff.
Yeah, so actually I was introduced to Seeds probably, I don't know, half a year ago now, or maybe even closer to a year ago. And when I first saw it, I was like, wow, this is exactly what we were envisioning with the common stack. I immediately reached out to Reiki, and we chatted a couple of times about conviction voting and some of the other mechanisms that we're working on in the common stack, because ultimately we're trying to build a library or a toolkit of components that could be used to create an economy like Seeds. And of course, they're well ahead in terms of their system design and everything, but they've been looking at conviction voting as a potential real-time governance tool that could be implemented at some point down the road. But this is exactly the kind of regenerative currencies we want to see launched, because we think the world, the political world, the economic world will be much more balanced when we have different options to choose from, and currencies that promote regenerative ecological practices and social practices are exactly what this world needs to see, without a doubt.
Could you share a little bit about conviction voting?
Yeah,
because I know it.
Yeah,
but
good idea.
Yeah.
Good idea.
Yeah.
I've talked about it so many times, I just assume everyone knows. No, conviction voting is I guess you could say it's a voting mechanism, but it kind of steps away from traditional voting. So traditional voting, it's been the same for more or less, 200 years. You write a check or an X on a piece of paper, you put it in a box, someone pulls it out, counts it, and says, okay, you're the president, or, prime minister, whatever. What conviction voting offers is a real-time alternative to that. So with blockchain, we have these rich temporal data streams. So every block you could vote, and you can say, I am for this or I am against this. And you have that over time accumulating kind of a community signal. So if you have, 100 people or 1,000 people or 1 million people in a country or dispersed around the world, you can suddenly get real-time feedback of how they choose to interact with your policies and governance processes. So you could say, here are 5 proposals on the table. Do you want A, B, C, or maybe C, D, E, or just A, or just E? Everyone in that community can vote, or it's kind of like preference streaming. So I have a preference to get this done over this. I'm going to assert my token holdings towards that preference. And over time, they actually gain in conviction. So this is still a very basic governance mechanism. We want to start with the minimum viable mechanisms when we go to this design. And Reiki actually brought up some really good questions in our Telegram chat a couple of weeks ago. But the reason behind conviction growing over time is to prevent these last minute whales coming in and voting, which we've seen in on-chain governance protocols before. On Aragon, for example, there was a big vote, and they noticed that like 10 minutes before the vote ended, say it's Tuesday night at 10 to 10, someone came in and just voted with all their tokens and changed the vote from no to yes. So there's kind of this still plutocratic undertones to the blockchain space today, where Bitcoin equals money, Ethereum equals money. You can just buy more with the cash in your pocket. So of course these systems are ruled by the whales, but we want to make sure that the minority holders in these communities, people who are there for a long time, asserting their preference, that they have a growing conviction. If someone comes in the last minute and says, I'm going to change this from a yes to a no, actually they don't get all that power right away. They have to wait for their conviction to grow, to challenge the status quo in this community. And of course, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, does that conviction is based on the time that you put your vote in, how long it's been there marinating, or how long you've personally been voting for? Like I've been voting for, I've voted on 100 proposals over the course of a year. I have more conviction. What's that part?
I mean, you could probably do both. In our basic implementation of conviction voting, it's the amount of time that your tokens are asserted for a particular proposal.
Okay.
So Reiki brought up the really great point that, do we want to incentivize people to not change their minds? Because that is an issue in the world today as well, right? If we just say, hey, the longer you have this preference, the more weight you gain, you'll incentivize people to never change their mind, which we don't want either, of course. Like that's something that needs to be considered in the overall system design. And you could implement something like you just recommended, Brandon. The longer you're part of that community, the more conviction your votes have. So you could do, this is the point of token engineering, and the way the common stack comes at the design of these mechanisms is there are many ways that could be suitable for appropriate contexts and appropriate communities. And we definitely don't, we're not saying, conviction voting is the governance solution, by no means, but it's one option. And it's a new option because it's continuous, because it's a real-time voting system that we've never been able to have before, because just logistically we couldn't, right? How would you do it? Especially with pen and paper voting systems, which we're still a part of.
I wonder, it's interesting to think about conviction voting kind of coupled with something like Telos DPoS, where you have the amount of tokens you hold have this value, but then you kind of unlock that value over the time that you've been a part of the community. Because like you're talking, one of the drawbacks of DPoS is that, and I think Reiki said, you can just go buy more of this. It's worth money. You go buy more, you have more weight. But it seems like that should be worth more if you've been a part of the community, not if you just popped in, bought $1 million worth of some coin, come in and influence the vote. So yeah, that's really interesting.
Well, that's the next place that we have to take extreme care and caution into how we design it. Because so we have this financial stack, which we were talking at the beginning of this, but on top of any financial system, we have a governance system. Every single one has a governing body, how it's designing it. And right now, cryptocurrencies are being designed, the best ones and the majority are the more tokens you have, the more voice you essentially get. And all then we're doing is we're creating an avenue for the old power structures to be able to come in with their tremendous amount of wealth, buy up the governance of it, and then just basically recreate it in their old image. And that's actually what we're seeing with a lot of currencies today, is they're just being co-opted in this very short-sighted, myopic way because they're allowed to be co-opted. So that's why we have to experiment with different forms of governance, where it's not a plutocracy. It's not how much wealth you have is how much voice you get. There's other ways we could be more nuanced to say, how are you adding value to the community? And let's give you voice there. One way of adding value is being part of it for a while, sure. But there's so many other ways we can actually track value. How many proposals have you put up? Have you voted on good proposals in the past? Are you voting on proposals? What are the outcome of those? Like, are you building tools in this ecosystem? Are you providing services for people in this ecosystem? Like, there's so many different ways we can say, how are you contributing? Track that and give people a voice based on those contributions, not necessarily the only question we're asking, which is how much money do you have? That's a very weird question to say how much voice you should get. Even the Greeks that came up with democracy knew that wasn't the best way to go. So yeah, anyway, so that's kind of also what I really want to get into next is alternative governance ideas. And I wanted to expand on Jeff's the common stack and the conviction voting, because we actually took some ideas of this and applied it to seeds and how we're operating it. So actually I can paint the picture. Right now, the central governments, they get a certain amount of money because of paying taxes, and then they choose what the budget is. So the same thing in the US. They determine how much money they're going to spend on X, Y, and Z. They put it up with Congress, and about 300 people decide how we're spending money for the year. Or however many people are in Congress, I don't know. What we are actually trying to propose is a complete alternative where everyone in the system shows up. So you can imagine if you're living in the States, you say, I want my taxes to go 30% to healthcare, 20% to education. I want another 10% to put a colony on moon, and et cetera, et cetera. You get to choose how your money is spent, and then you put that up. And then this aggregates with everyone's information, and that's what then determines the budget. This is how we're going to spend funds as a collective society. And this is where conviction voting can get really cool, or contribution voting, or whatever you want to call it. But the more voice and weight someone has in the system is going to impact that budget more. And then what's really cool is you get into all this game theory, because now if you get more voice for contributing, it gives you another incentive to contribute to this system. So, and this is what I'm saying, what's going to come to the market is systems that are offering you more voice and value for participating in them is ones that you're going to step into, and step out of the ones that are just extracting value from you and not giving you any voice. Because that's the other thing. I know I'm all over the place, but there's this saying that for any technology to replace an incumbent technology, it has to be 10 times better than the previous for it to really get that adoption. I'm actually seeing that's what's coming to fore right now. Like the amount of value you can get from a new system, the amount of voice, the amount of inclusion, the amount of ability to actually have a say in how things are going and be able to evolve it is at least 10 orders of magnitude, not even 10 times better in these new systems that are coming out than in the ones that we've adopted at birth. Yeah.
And I think we really haven't even begun to understand the potential of multiple currencies and how we can leverage that. I could develop a currency that offered, or an economy, that offered a service, and anyone who is paying in seeds tokens gets 10% off, or anyone who holds at least 10,000 seeds gets membership in my community, or however you want to do that. You can, it's really the communities you hold then become sort of like a value signaling. I hold then maximalism can be also aligned with your values. We make fun of maximalism in the crypto space. Bitcoin maximalists who think there will be no other technologies that are useful beyond Bitcoin is funny, but in the future I may say I'm only willing to work for seeds, or I may only be willing to work for save the Amazon tokens. You can really align your income with your values, and you can offer, different groups can offer benefits or discounts or membership or anything to the holdings that a user has. So you're really putting your values, you're putting your money where your mouth is, and you're able to leverage that in a lot of interesting ways moving forward, or you will be anyway.
Yeah, and I want to give one example because I think that's so cool to have this diversity of salaries is typically how someone's at negotiating, or what their previous market rate was. It's not necessarily tied to how much value they're adding to the system. So salaries are just inherently flawed. And we came up with this idea of gratitude, so that people come to the system and other people recognize value that people are bringing, and they're able to offer them gratitude. And what this looks like is at the beginning of each month, people are given X number of gratitude tokens. And if you don't spend them, you lose them. So there's this incentive to be able to make sure you're looking for things to be grateful for. And we actually encourage this culture of being grateful and recognizing that and acknowledging each other for the value we're bringing. And then as these tokens are then distributed throughout that month, it's then signaling and showing who's adding value and who's being recognized. And that's a part of our salaries right now. But that's, again, paying this back over to how this could work on a civilization. Now imagine that every person within the culture is given 100 gratitude tokens at the beginning of the month. And you need to spend them or you lose them. So at this point, I mean, the reason I came up with, or we've talked about this on a cultural level, is there's some really good use cases. People who like to heal and people who create art have a very difficult time charging for these services, even though they're really beautiful and humanity needs them. So, I mean, I've met so many different healers in my life, and they're just like, wow, I just want to give this gift, but I also need to eat food. So now I've got to like give this gift that I really want to give to this person. And then after this really beautiful exchange, I have to be like, hey, I need $100. And it's this really kind of disgusting thing. So what we wanted to do is say like, hey, everyone gets these 100 gratitudes. And now someone shows up and, you know, gives you that gift of healing, and you don't have to pay them outright. What you can do is like, wow, I was really grateful for that. And then you click a button, you send them some gratitude. And then this person who's receiving a lot of gratitude from a lot of people because they're out there giving their gifts now can actually be translated into a salary. So that what this would look like is, again, let's pretend like this was mapped over the US. They created, you know, $4 trillion. 1 trillion of that was actually reserved to give out to all these people based on how much gratitude they've received throughout the whole society. So there's finances that are actually able to fund this, and then you just look and see who creates gratitude. And now we've just created an incentive for people to go out there and do things for people to be grateful for. So we've just created this culture where everyone's trying to, like, you know, be kind to each other, be grateful, like be present with each other, give gifts. And it's just like we've incentivized, you know, these behaviors that we're wanting in our society. And this is what we can start doing with different types of tokens, is like having all these different experiments where it's not just so basic as, hey, this token does an exchange for me, or this token raises value. Now it's like, well, I actually have to spend this in a certain amount of time, and the way I spend it is going to have these effects. It's like, oh, okay. We can get much more rich with how we design these different financial tools.
I've been curious or thinking about kind of, you know, when I talk to people about the blockchain, and you know, most people throw their hands up and they're like, well, what is it useful for? And I said, well, the internet was around, you know, decades before there was a web browser. It just wasn't really useful to people. It was interesting to you know, nerds who were passing around, you know, packet switching and so on. But before there was an internet browser, it wasn't useful to people. I wonder if there will be like an economy browser or a currency browser, you know, somewhere in our future that people can find these communities, these currencies that are aligned with their value systems and how they all interrelate. You know, I imagine by then there might be multiple different seeds or different forms of seeds or offshoots of seeds that focus on one, you know, particular incentive or one particular region, or I'm curious how that will turn out in the long run.
Yeah, that's a whole beautiful happening coming on.
Yeah, I see that.
Oh, sorry, go on. Yeah.
No.
Okay, I'll leave this and then I'll let you go.
Yeah, go.
Okay. I love the analogy with the internet because, you know, back in the 90s and early 2000s, even we see these, you know, newscasters being like, what is this even used for? Like, who's going to use internet, you know? And they had no concept that internet was going to be such a fundamental part of our lives, and that it would just be so ubiquitous and obvious that, yes, of course, we're using the internet. And that's just with hindsight. And I'm saying we're gathering that hindsight now. Like, it's going to be so obvious for people 10 years from now to be like, yes, of course we had these opt-in societies where we got to choose where we distributed our value and got more voice. Like, obviously this made sense for us to do that. Like, why the heck were we just like accepting what we were born with? That's ridiculous. Like, it's just going to be so obvious that this was going to happen. But and I think actually so many people are coming on to that obviousness. And that's why we start seeing this like kickoff again of the cryptocurrency. And, you know, related back into the market, we see it starting to pick up because people are noticing the real use case behind it and the real potential behind it. And that's what I think this next decade is about, is less about speculation and more about this actual use case coming online.
Yeah, I like how you talked about the adoption of the internet and how people didn't see it coming, but it's so obvious in hindsight. And I think that when you bring up, like Jeff was bringing up the ease of use and like some sort of browser system, it kind of makes me picture all of these different currencies as like an app on the phone. And once we have inter-blockchain communication, like some sort of seamless way to just, it doesn't matter which token you use, it just kind of happens all on the back end. People almost just kind of bounce around through them in the same way that they have loyalty to apps for a certain amount of time. Like I used to use Facebook 10 years ago, and then, I bounced off that app, and then I started using Instagram, and then I stopped using Instagram. I used Reddit, and then I used Twitter. And it's like, I see the tokens someday kind of coming alive like that. It's just the internet community that you're a part of. Your values align, and during that time when they align, it's seamless, because the doesn't matter what token you use, it's all the same. It kind of easily happens on the back end. You're just there for the community. And so kind of the browser feature made me think of that. Like, yeah, there could be some sort of app store or for currencies, but I think people will be drawn in by what's the community actually doing, and how does that align with them. And then as that becomes easier and easier, I think it can be a really natural human interaction. That's kind of a cool way to think about it.
I like where you ended with that, is it's natural human value. And I mean, even today, if you have a couple of different currencies, you have to go over to an exchange, you sell one, you buy another, you have it. I think in the future, all of that will be abstracted away by some app or, AI assistant that, if you're holding seeds and you walk into Tim Hortons or Starbucks or whatever, and you tap your phone, it will automatically, say, okay, I'm going to, liquidate this many seeds, buy this many Starbucks coin or whatever coin, whatever, discount you get at that chain. All of that will just be in the background, and we can stop thinking about money and we can start thinking about value rather than currencies and bank accounts and so on.
Yeah, and with that app, analogy you used earlier, I think, again, what's so revolutionary about this system is we're bouncing around from Facebook to Instagram to Reddit because we don't have any voice in those systems, and they're not actually paying us to help develop them. So that's what's so different about this next one, is we'll step into a system, and now if you don't like how it's being governed, you don't have to leave and step out to another. You can participate in governance. You can say your voice and actually see that have an impact, and it can be meaningful. And better, you can even get paid for doing it. So I'm looking at a world where you wake up in the morning and you don't have a job necessarily. You work at 50 different things, and you're just engaging in an app. You're like, hey, I have a really good idea for you. You could put that idea forward. You can get paid to do it. And that could all happen in a seamless, really beautiful way. So now people are just saying, what do I want to do today? What value do I want to add to the world? And there's all this diversity of ways to add value, rather than, oh, this is how I make money. It's, I add value in all the communities I'm in, and they pay me for that.
Yeah, that's a good segue into this. This is part of, what we're doing right now is an example, a small example of that. I use the Telos worker proposal system. That's what this is. These podcasts are funded by. As part of the EOS community, I still am. Came to help out in the Telos community as well. This ability to add value in the way that you can uniquely add value, get some sort of compensation from your community, and help the community at the same time. It's like that interaction is such a beautiful thing, and that kind of growing to be more pervasive around the world. There's so much human potential and creative potential that can be unlocked with these types of systems. And the worker proposal system on Telos is just the tip of the iceberg. Every community in the world can be doing things like this. It's a really cool thing.
Oh yeah. Imagine if Facebook had 3 billion part-time contractors opposed to 50,000 employees. The amount of knowledge and wisdom Facebook could really be holding and using to drive its own evolution would be ridiculous. And there'd be more stickiness. I hate Facebook because I hate the algorithms, and I don't have any say in how those are evolved. It's not clearly pure,
Facebook's such a good example because you have people who have strong opinions, and the only way they can voice their opinion is to, hashtag delete Facebook. And then it feels like, you do that, and it almost feels like, man, I was kind of punished because now, I'm disconnected from people. Maybe
ostracized.
I only see there, and it's like, I took a stand and I kind of, pay for it in some ways, as opposed to being able to take some sort of positive stand. I want to actually change these algorithms on Facebook and keep using it, just make it a more human experience. So.
Have you guys kept up with Secure Scuttlebutt at all? Have you heard of that before? Something to check out. It's basically social media network where you control your own algorithm. Everyone can choose their own algorithm. Open data layers. The data's all yours. You can monetize it if you want. You don't have to. I don't know how much of this is implemented versus planned, but there's secure scuttlebutt, some really cool, the future of social media is there in those
Cool.
ideas, I think. Yeah.
I mean, it's unfortunate that if you break it down, it breaks down into SS, which has its own connotations with it, like, especially when it comes to monitoring and security. But hey,
Yeah, true.
Yeah, that sounds really cool. I'll definitely look into that. I want to segue back into Telos because they're one of the most perfect existing real-time examples of what we've been discussing today about, having a workable proposal system, which is exactly that. They have this funds that they're able to finance projects. And you're talking about, how do we give these zero interest loans? Well, Telos can do it today. They can actually, instead of doing grants, they can turn it into loans. We can give grants for some things that are nonprofit, and we can give loans for other things that are for profit. We can be a little bit more nuanced with how we're delivering resources in that system. But yeah, for people who aren't familiar with Telos, definitely hop over there and start seeing that, because you can participate in governance, you can have your ideas funded, and it's a version 3.0 already of what our future civilizations can be built on top of. And it's evolving really, really fast.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jeff, I know that Common Stack has had a little bit, has looked into Telos a little bit. Did you have any questions about Telos blockchain, and what type of needs is Common Stack looking for?
Yeah, so actually, I think there's a very much a two-way benefit to organization, to collaborations between organizations like the Telos Foundation and the Common Stack, because essentially what we're trying to do at the Common Stack is to create infrastructure for that exact kind of grant system. And I mean, this is common throughout the blockchain space. That you have the Ethereum Foundation, the Ethereum Community Fund. There are all sorts of grant giving bodies, because you have no lack of eager developers who want to develop on this technology. So you have these grant bodies forming under different organizations that hold a lot of these tokens, and they give out grants, and work is done most of the time, and it's brings value most of the time. Now, granted, there are some times, if you weren't so on it with these podcasts, for example, maybe you applied for a grant and then just didn't do anything with it, right? And this happens in some communities, is that money is taken, and then there's no value returned to the community. So we actually need to close the loop on did the work actually get done? There needs to be almost like an escrow service, which is another part of the Common Stack, is this proposal engine, the Giveth proposal engine, where once a proposal is approved, so Brandon's podcast can go forward, well, it's only on milestone completion that the funds are actually sent. So, when you deliver the podcast, when you deliver the value, then you're paid, as opposed to you just getting the money and then going. So, I mean, we have these early grant giving systems, but we really need to close the loop of accountability, decision making. Who made the decision to fund this podcast? It might have been 5 people at the Telos Foundation. So like, we really want to make sure the whole community is engaged through something like conviction voting, that those funds actually deliver value through a proposal system like Giveth. So the tools we're building, I think, could benefit a lot of these different organizations. We've done a lot of work on the R&D side. So we are coming at this from a rigorous token engineering methodology. So we're doing the system design, and then we're simulating these systems with agent-based modeling. So it's kind of a bottom-up. It's not simulating, like predicting people's behavior, but bottom-up, kind of setting the incentives in the system and then seeing how people respond. So it's basically kind of like an economic simulator. When we build bridges, when we do engineering in the real world, we simulate our circuits before they go into smartphones. We simulate our bridges before cars drive on them. But today in the crypto space, we don't simulate before we launch our code, because we've never known how up until now. We haven't had the tools. So CAD is a complex, it's called Complex Adaptive Dynamics Computer Aided Design. So it's basically sort of an economic simulator where you can put in agents and they respond to system incentives, and you can see, not necessarily predicting what people will do, but at least a broad envelope of like system behavior. So you can see, hey, if this kind of policy is implemented, look what happens. Everyone and dumps and goes over there. So it'll be an interesting way to validate and verify these designs before we launch them in the real world. So we've been in the R&D phase of the Common Stack for quite a while. It's quite a rigorous process to establish these standards before they exist in the first place, which is why obviously the first time takes a bit more time and effort. Then we're hoping these templates, these libraries can act sort of like a CAD template. If you want to create another water bottle in CAD, you can just take an existing water bottle, maybe remove this loop, change the mouth, and then you've got a new water bottle. You can 3D print it and you're good to go. So that's kind of what we want to do for economic design, is create these templates and blueprints that people can say, okay, I want that governance mechanism and that funding mechanism, and we'll plug them together, simulate it, see how it works, and then go to code once we know we've addressed the attack vectors in the system. So yeah, it would be interesting to chat with the Telos Foundation and see if they're interested in these kinds of tools, because we're basically looking to crowdfund the building of these tools, or at least the reference implementations, because we have a lot of interest in the Ethereum community, but we've definitely had some interest peaked in the EOS community and the Telos community as well, and Holochain. Really interesting stuff in the agent-centric architectures as well. So yeah, it'll be cool to see how this rolls out. But I think token engineering is useful on any chain, really.
Oh, absolutely. And, there's so many discussions and debates happening in Telos right now about the worker proposal system, like how are we delivering funds, like how are we doing inflation, like what's going on at the T-Rex and all this stuff. And there isn't any way to model it before we try it out there. So we put it out in the real world, like, shoot, the token dropped to 20%. That's not working. Let's try it again. So it would be invaluable to have these types of tools that we could easily plug into. So it's not people just debating opinions back and forth. We would have some sort of empirical evidence to point to, be like, hey, actually I tried your thing. I put it in here and look what happened. And they could be like, oh, okay, yeah, bad idea. Sorry. But we don't have that right now, which is, if you put a proposal together for Telos, you've got my support,
Sweet.
Yeah, absolutely. You got my support too. I think that right now, to me, it's one of the most interesting worker proposal systems that's functioning, because it built off a lot of, Steam's got a work proposal system, Dash had a work proposal system, I think still does. There's been some really cool goes at the work proposal system, but there's been some fatal flaws, and one of them is the accountability. And so kind of one of the interesting ways they're approaching accountability is releasing money in cycles. So like you're saying, that as these milestones are hit, funds are released. But like you're saying, having the CAD there to kind of stress test changes, big changes before they're implemented is a great idea. I think that one of the interesting ones they're coming to right now, one of the discussions that's happening is around marketing, because marketing, especially with blockchain, it's hard to have some sort of measurables to deliver. What are the deliverables? What do you need to actually see from this marketing team to make you say that it was worth this many telos? And so there's a lot of just human debate going on because we don't have the measurables in place. So there's all kinds of little tweaks that are trying to be made, but the tools that you're building would probably be invaluable. It's just more discussion, so that'd be huge.
Yeah, and that's the kind of the way we're approaching this. These tools are super useful to everyone. They're public goods. If we create them and Ethereum developers use it, that doesn't exclude Telos from also using it. So we're kind of throwing this out there to the whole blockchain space and beyond, and saying, I think the world would benefit from these kinds of open source tools if we can, crowdfund their development and the R&D behind it. Everyone will benefit in the long run. So yeah, hopefully we can kind of get that critical mass. I think over the next few months, we'll be sliding into our fundraise for the augmented bonding curve, and then we're kind of pursuing an iterative build strategy. So we're building one component at a time, kind of sandboxing it in a test economy, then building the next component, adding to it, not necessarily in a waterfall. We can start on a couple of them at the same time, depending how the fundraise goes. But yeah, we're looking to keep it lean and kind of do like the engineering iteration build, and have these components available for any project or chain or individual or community that is interested in using them.
So, best case scenario, when would Telos be able to come into CAD and all these tools and start doing economic modeling with a good certainty of the outcome? Is this something that you 1 year out, 2 year, next week?
I mean, CAD is open source right now. So, I mean, it depends on, it's open source, so you can start right away. The skills required to use CAD at this stage are definitely a little bit in depth. So you need familiarity with the Python stack, with data science, with complex system design, with agent-based modeling. So I mean, there's a certain type of expertise required to use CAD. When actually the Common Stack is funding through our raise a lot of development on CAD to make it a much more user-friendly tool. We would love to have a user interface that you could just drag and drop. I want the bonding curve and I want a conviction voting governance mechanism and like this, and then simulate. Like that would be lovely. You see that in some game design tools. Actually, there's a really cool one called Machinations. I've never said that out loud. But really cool. Like you can drag and drop and then hit play, and it shows you how the game dynamics play out. Of course, that's not for something as complicated as an economy. We're just talking about game simulation. But I would love to see CAD progress so it's that easy to use for someone who wants to design a community currency. And at that point, yeah, I think everyone will be using it. But I think if Telos has the interest in doing some modeling, there's definitely a CAD community coalescing around using the tool. And it's only going to get better as more developers are in it and on it, and funding is the key. So that's where we're really excited about the bonding curve as providing this a source of funding. It's basically like that. It's almost like a non-profit investment vehicle, like a community investment vehicle. So you can pool money into, I guess, if we haven't talked much about bonding curves on this call, have we? But they're essentially a way that a community can pool money, allocate it towards providing useful things for the community. So we, with the Telos Foundation, they've got the funds. You apply to them with a proposal, they will dole that out. But what if the two of you had an idea that you wanted to have grants or create a grant system, but you don't have a pool of money? Well, the bonding curve is kind of that tool where you say, hey, community, are we interested in creating some kind of grant system for our community? Let's all pool our money in this bonding curve system. We'll allocate it to things that are useful for this community, and basically recreate that whole grant giving system for yourselves rather than applying to an outside foundation for it.
Interesting. Can you explain a little bit more about the bonding curve, like that what it does make sense? Can you explain kind of how it works?
Yeah. So again, the bonding curve is a very wide open design space. So there's a lot of different directions you can go with it. And there have been a few different experiments so far. Actually, there's a few live on mainnet, which are pretty exciting. But again, they're built for very niche use cases. So I think we haven't seen the full exploration of what they can do. But essentially, they're people put money into the bonding curve, and in the most basic bonding curve, it all just goes into a reserve, into a collateral pool. So you put in DAI or dollars, and you get out bonding curve tokens. So there's the earliest bonding curves were actually just straight Ponzi schemes. They said, put money into this curve, and it will issue you a token. But the more tokens there are in existence, the more the price of those tokens will go up. So if I bought, and then Brandon bought, and then Reiki bought, then I'm going to sell and rip both of you off. So I mean, at its core, at its most basic, the bonding curve is that kind of Ponzi scheme-esque. But if you play with the design of it a little bit, what we did with the augmented bonding curve is we split into two pools of value. So when you put in your dollars and you receive bonding curve tokens, Part of your dollars go into a reserve. So in other words, if you sell your tokens back to the bonding curve, you get some of that reserve, but it also goes into a community funding pool. And the tokens, your bonding curve tokens, are good for governance over that funding pool. So you can say, okay, we've now pooled our funds. 70% of it is in reserve, 30% of it is in the funding pool. Now we can say, hey, we want to have sustainable agriculture in our community. Let's allocate 10% of that funding pool towards exactly like Reiki's doing with seeds, towards organic farming, towards anything your community desires. And then if you're interested in selling those bonding curve tokens, you get back a portion of your funds from the collateral pool. So it's essentially like a community fund pooling mechanism, because this is how we get things done at scale. When we first wanted to make transnational railway networks, or when they were funding international journeys to India and America, this was when the joint stock came about, where wealthy businessmen, up until then, they would just fund their own endeavors, right? But at that point, it got so expensive that they had to pool their money. So they said, okay, how about we get a bunch of people to buy this stock, and you all own a portion of this company, and now we can build massive networks of international railway lines. We can build telecommunications networks. We can build, so essentially stock markets came about by people pooling their money and then getting things done. Same thing with tax pools, same thing with your condo board, right? You pay condo fees, and then those condo fees go towards making that neighborhood better. So this is essentially a new way that without an intermediary, people can come together and say, let's pool our resources and spend them how we see fit with our value systems. And that could be at a small level. It could also be at a massive level. We really haven't seen how far this experiment can go just yet. It'll be interesting to see it play out.
Reiki, do you see any use or any use cases for bonding curves as far as seeds goes?
I don't know. I guess that's where the experiment might guide us. In our current designs, we don't have it implemented anywhere, and I'm not necessarily sure what component it would replace. Because Seeds itself isn't actually doing any fundraising for it. It's actually being built by Haifa, so Haifa is doing some fundraising. So the bonding curve could work for Haifa in the effort that it's using to raise funds in order to build its tools. But we've already raised a lot of funds, and we've used a different model to do that. So it would be good, unless I'm wrong, Jeff. So that's just why we haven't looked into it. Is just it's not something that we feel like we actually need right now. And it sounds beautiful, and I definitely love that for the ability to be able to have people come together with ideas and set up new funding mechanisms that help them get it done. So the more options that people have for that to be able to better express their purpose, like, the better for me.
Yeah, totally. And I think it has some place in communal actions towards shared purpose. So I was speaking with HoloChain as well. They're implementing or actually Commons Engine in particular, but they're implementing a mutual credit system. And they weren't sure exactly where bonding curves fit into a mutual credit system, because with a mutual credit system, you can issue that currency between two people at 0% interest. So why do you need bonding curves to raise funds? But my question was, well, within a mutual credit system, how do people, pool their credit and then get things done with that pool of funds? So I'm interested to see where it will fit into some of these ecosystems as it gets easier to use, because right now, not only is it hard to understand, there's also barely any tools to implement them. So we're still in very, very early stages of the research around this kind of technology.
Yeah, it's kind of a funny question asking to like really experimental projects, like if they can use each other's tech. It's like, it's not there yet, buddy. Hold on.
Yeah,
we're all like experimenting on the bleeding edge here. So let's get one thing done at a time.
Yeah.
Well, Killer, we've covered a lot here, a lot with seeds, and for people listening, we have a more in-depth dive into seeds and all the all the new things have been happening there. That's coming up shortly. So that's why we didn't dig too deep into seeds. But we've covered a lot with seeds, common stack, kind of new governance, the new monetary system, opting in and out of communities. One thing I wanted to say about communities, I know this is probably a little late in the podcast to give like a bigger picture overview, but I think it's for people to grasp the concept that a different concept of communities, because it's been so long that your community is just your boots on the ground where you're standing on the soil. But with computers, like our ability to shoot through space and time all over the world, you can really be anywhere on the globe at any time. And it becomes really a where do you want to be located, and not physically, but your community is basically sitting out in space wherever it wants to be. So when we talk about communities and all this, it's hard to break free of the notion that your community is where you're standing. Your community is where you're interacting in cyberspace, essentially. And I think that's such a cool concept that someday people look back and say, yeah, of course, like you both were talking about the internet in the past. But right now, people aren't. It's not clicking necessarily. But someday, 10 years, 20 years from now, people look, yeah, of course, your community is who you're hanging out with on the internet. So
yeah, I want to make sure that we say an and there, because I don't think it's an or. So I think we're gonna have really beautiful physical communities too that you're a part of, but that physical community is also part of this decentralized global network of communities. Like, maybe those 10 houses are part of it, but that's the only 10 houses in the neighborhood. But then people in that community is also in the neighborhood over, and the country over, and the nation. It's like, so we're going to decentralize the global community, but still have physical communities. So I think we're experimenting in both sections right now, and we can have all of it. Humans want all of it, and we can have. So.
I like that idea. I do. We do homesteading like on our property here, and our neighbors don't necessarily do homesteading, but like some of my buddies in Santa Cruz, like 15 minutes away, do homesteading. And that I know people in other parts of the states to do homesteading. It's a cool thought that we kind of have our local communities, but then we kind of have this broader community of people, both digital and on the ground, where we can kind of at some point kind of connect like we were neighbors. And that'll be cool. And it sounds like that's part of what Seeds is facilitating as well, is those kinds of like connections on the ground and in cyberspace.
Yes. Last thing, I know we're late, but I do want to put this. Okay. So it'd be like as if all the homesteaders came together to create their own. So that your community is your physical place that you've got your group of homesteading families, but then it's also this global network of homesteading families that are all over the place, that are all like using the same currency, having a governance system and all this stuff. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this is where I see like these communities popping up.
Absolutely.
But anyway.
Oh, absolutely. And we have time to hop into any other final topics. I want to make sure that we kind of hit all the big points that each of you want to talk about. So Jeff or Reiki, go ahead and kind of jump in with a final topic that either of you have.
Yeah, I mean, actually, we started the call off with a pretty interesting topic, and like the upcoming elections in America, and the questions around, how do we move forward with a pattern for a new society and new economies. And I think we've chatted about a few different avenues there, but it'll be really interesting, to look back on, we look back on our monarchy systems and we think, wow, how outdated, like the oldest son of the last person in charge was in charge, no matter how much of an idiot he was, no matter how much of a bigot he was. And now we're facing potentially, one of the most impactful elections in the world. And really, like, the Democratic primaries are going on right now. They'll select one person, and then it's him or Trump, or her and Trump. And really, it's only two people. We're looking back at these monarchy systems, being like, man, how archaic. There are 300 million people in the U.S. I'm sitting with two very bright members right now who probably have great ideas on how things should go. I'm not saying being politicians or anything, but I think we have this barrier to entry of being a politician. And I think we can really, with this technology, dissolve that, remove the barriers to entry, and create this grassroots democracy that allow people to be delegates without being politicians, be able to exert your your knowledge and your expertise in a domain specific area where it's useful. You don't need a doctor flying a plane, and you don't need a pilot in the operating room. But if we can, allow people to exert governance on areas that their wisdom, their experience, and their trust in the community comes in, I think we'll really create a new framework for a much more resilient society moving forward.
Yeah, and just poking to the need for evolution, just building on top of what Jeff was saying, is we have a system right now where one person can drunkenly text a message, tweet a message that affects billions of people. That system is inherently flawed. And the more serious issue is the people that want this really, really terrible, intense position have psychopathic tendencies. It's not your most beautiful people that want this position. So what we did is we set up a system that encourages all the psychopaths to fight over each other to get into this position of power that can affect billions of people. It's like, why did we do that? I mean, I understand like how it got here, but now that we are here, we can look at it and say, whoa, this experiment got way out of control. Time for us to have a reboot.
We can do better. Yeah. I'm excited for the day that politics just turns into another form of reality TV, because it almost already is, watching the, election on, but then we can give the important decisions to people who actually like make good decisions, have skin in the game, accountability, all of those things, and just let the spectacle be a spectacle.
Yeah, I mean, they can just pick up jobs in Hollywood, and we can have a reality TV show where we keep it going and we laugh about how it used to be, and they can just keep playing the roles all the same, But then their voices actually have no real world, effect.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And the representative democracy thing is interesting because kind of the overall thought behind it is that, you elect someone you trust because they can make good decisions on your behalf. But, where that starts to fall apart is the idea that these people are experts in everything. They're making laws, let's say laws about farming, but they probably know nothing about like the needs of an organic farmer, then they're also making laws about oil drilling, or they're making laws about the shipping industry. Like they can't be our delegated representatives can't be an expert in all these different areas. It's just not even possible. So kind of the general assumption that you're going to elect someone who's smart enough to make all these decisions is just inherently flawed because no one's that smart. And so you're electing these people who are kind of guessing at all this stuff. Whereas the system that you're both talking about is this idea that the people who have specialized knowledge have more influence over making the decisions in these specialized places. And then it becomes less of trading favors in some political system and more of what we're kind of the vision of what that sport of representative democracy is supposed to be, like actually someone who knows. You let them kind of have more weight with their decision because they actually know. All right, Mr. Jeff, you got any final thoughts for the Telos podcast friends here?
There's so many rabbit holes we could continue diving down. I mean, we just chatted about representative democracy. Liquid democracy is really interesting to me. It's kind of a merging of representative and direct. Each have their own problems. Liquid democracy is somewhere in the middle, mitigating both of those problems. But anyway, I think that's a longer conversation for another time. So I'm sure we can do this again. These are always a lot of fun.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, Jeff, it was great to have you on the show again, and we will have you back again. You're always invited. And the Common Stack, go check it out. Seeds, go check it out. Telos, DPOS, go check it out. And that's the show for today, my Telos podcast friends. Cheers.